Hello and welcome. My name is Corinne Caillaud. I am a professor at the University of Sydney in the Faculty of Medicine and Health and member of the Charles Perkins Centre. The title of my presentation today is Insights into Adolescents' Physical Activity in the Pacific Islands from Mixed Methods Research, and this presentation is part of the Asia-Pacific Society for Physical Activity webinar series exploring how youth physical activity can be strengthened in the Pacific, challenges and future direction. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners on the land on which I'm recording this video, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I would like to start by introducing key people who have contributed and co-led this work with me. And I would like to name Associate Professor Olivier Galli, who is a key collaborator for many years now in this area of research. We co-lead the Pacific Youth Connect research group. And I would like also to acknowledge the contribution of my colleagues from the University of Sydney, Associate Professor Louisa Peralta, Dr. Renata Forsyth, Dr. Christina Amon, and Juliana Chen. We are a great team of multidisciplinary academic trying to unpack physical activity in the Pacific Islands. I would like first to position the global context for physical activity. This is no different in Oceania, where similar results have been found. And here the results are from global studies exploring the prevalence of insufficient physical activity. It's been published in 2020 by Goethals and collaborators in the Lancet. The definition of insufficient physical activity in this publication was based on the WHO recommendation on physical activity for health. So insufficient physical activity was when young people were not engaging in at least 60 minutes daily of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So across the different countries that were investigating in this paper, overall, it's been identified that 81% of adolescents aged 11 to 70 are insufficiently physically active. And the situation is not different in the Pacific Island. In this presentation, I'm going to provide some insights and data specifically in New Caledonia and Vanuatu. So the research question we aimed to investigate were how does place influence adolescents' physical activity pattern in the Pacific Islands, and how can wearable activity trackers and digital technologies be leveraged for strengthening youth physical activity in Pacific context. We have worked in different Pacific Island countries and specifically New Caledonia, where a lot of our work was positioned, but also in Vanuatu, in Solomon Islands and Fiji. We have started to engage with young people and stakeholders to understand context. So in this work, we have used mixed methods approach using qualitative methodologies to explore views, attitudes, and context. And this included interviews and participatory workshops. In addition, we also have attempted to collect information about physical activity using the IPAC short form, which is the International Physical Activity Questionnaire, that was adapted in French context. Wide part of our work was to understand how digital technologies and activity trackers could be used to assess physical activity in young people in a more objective way, and also if it could be used to deliver health promotion initiatives. It was also a way for us to explore through data mining methodologies the high volume of data that is actually provided by activity trackers. In terms of participants, the age range across our different studies is 12 to 16 years with a sample size of 25 to 500 participants. and we mostly worked in school context, and some of these schools were located in very remote areas of the Pacific Islands, in Vanuatu, for example, on this picture, or in New Caledonia. All right, so let's now have a look at some data we collected. I'm going to start with data collected in New Caledonia. This was across 3 different schools, engaged with 160 participants, aged 13 years. So when we asked the young people about the different physical activity they were engaging with, most of the time they answer about the type of sports they are engaging with. And we can see on this slide that is a word cloud that there's a quite good diversity of sports they have opportunities to engage with, but that volleyball and football, and here I mean soccer, are really prevalent. And this is the case in most of the communities we have engaged with in the Pacific Islands. Okay, so let's explore some data. On this slide, you have 3 drawings that we're collecting during a participatory research workshop with young people in New Caledonia. And you can see that these drawings provide a rich qualitative material for investigating adolescents' preferred activities as part of the school physical activity festival. What was interesting, and that we can note from analysis of the drawings we collected, was the high prevalence of outdoors activities, the high presence as well of soccer and volleyball, and the mention of sports like rock climbing and sailing, indicating that the young people had access to facilities to practice these sports. There were some mentions as well of strength training in a gym environment. So another study was published by Guillaume Watelez more recently, and this study investigated physical activity in adolescents living in rural and urban New Caledonia, and explored as well the role of the social environmental factors and the association with weight status. So here I'm just going to present the data related to physical activity. On the picture at the top of the slide, you can see where the schools were located in the New Caledonia territory. So overall, what we found was that 60% of adolescents engage in at least 60 minutes of physical activity a day. But through using this survey, we couldn't really make the difference between the different levels of physical activity. We found as well that Melanesian adolescents who lived in rural communities, specifically male, were more active, up to 78 of them engage in at least 60 minutes of physical activity a day. In that study, we didn't find significant difference between male and female participants. So the fact that we could not really identify MVPA was an issue we tried to address through using physical activity trackers. So in our research using digital technologies and trackers, we used 2 different types of trackers. The GeneActive on the left side in this slide, which is a research-grade tracker validated in adolescents and providing raw data, a high volume of raw data that is suitable for data mining techniques analysis. We also used the Misfit as part of the iEngage program, which was a digitalized physical activity promotion program, and it's a consumer-grade technology that reports step count to the user. You can see on the picture at the top of the slide that we didn't really have any issues for young people engaging in wearing the trackers. They were actually very interested in the study and engaging with the technology. On this slide, I present the data from a study that was led by Solène Bertrand-Prota. The study was run in one of the French Pacific territories, Wallis and Futuna. In this study, 32 participants wore physical activity tracker GeneActive for several days. And what we found was that 84 of the participants engaged in at least 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a day. This was markedly different from global and Oceania estimates for physical activity. So we tried to understand a little bit how this can be explained. We found that the school day includes 3 recess periods and a 2-hour lunch break. The school environments provide large open spaces that facilitate physical activity and free play, with sporting equipment such as balls readily available to students. 3 after-school sports programs were attended by 55% of adolescents. So this study highlights that the school environment and the school policies and the provision of free activity after school were probably key to supporting students engaging in physical activity. I mean, of course, we need to investigate more, but this is a very good example of something very successful that is happening in the Pacific. Over the next few slides, I would like to present Engage. I will talk a little bit about the design in this slide, and then I will provide the main outcomes. Engage is a self-paced learning program designed to enhance digital health and physical literacy. As part of the program, participants learn how to use activity trackers and digital technologies to set goals and monitor their physical activity levels. On the left side of the slide, you can see the Engage toolkit, which was made of 1 tablet, 1 activity tracker, earphones, paper booklet, and pen. So the students used the digital technology to set and evaluate the physical activity, and they could reflect in the booklet about their physical activity engagement. We found that overall during the program, 50% of days were classified as active days, which means that participants reached at least 11,000 steps a day, and physical activity was accumulated throughout the day at school and in the community. An important result when we analyzed the continuous data provided by the trackers during the 5 weeks of the program was that the daily steps increased during the program, which was very good news, and validated the fact that the program was effective in increasing physical activity in young people. But a very important result was that the daily steps change was not linear. And we had variation during the 5 weeks of the program, and some of these variation were connected to the weather. So on very wet days, for example, there was a drop of physical activity. So it's a very good insight into methodologies in assessing the effectiveness of interventions to, if possible, not only have a pre-post measure, but as well evaluate what's happening during the full duration of the program. We also found that adolescents with the lowest daily steps at the beginning of the program benefited the most from the program. So if we try to recapitulate about physical activity in adolescents in Pacific context, what can we say? So overall, in our study, MVPA engagement was higher than global and Oceania estimates. And this needs more investigation to really confirm this data and understand the drivers of physical activity in Pacific Island context. So we identified a few of these drivers. For example, in New Caledonia, participating in community activities was a strong driver of physical activity engagement in Melanesian adolescents. Twice as many Melanesian adolescents made physical activity recommendations in rural areas compared to those living in urban areas. In Wallis and Futuna, we identified the role of the school system in promoting physical activity engagement, with 84% of the participants engaging in 60 minutes of MVPA daily on average. So before I conclude this presentation, I wanted to say a few words about the work that goes in the background in engaging and co-designing our intervention or our studies with the community. So, for example, when I was talking about the Engage program, What was a key driver of engagement of the students in the program was that we partner with community leaders, for example, the spiritual leaders in the community, to provide some short videos embedded in the program that were connected with students in their own language. We also engaged with the local physical education teacher, and the teacher was able to, again, shoot some small videos in which it was demonstrated some key physical activity skills. When we went in the community, there's a lot of work that is done to engage with community members, explain what we do, and being accepted and really have a shared understanding of what we want to do with our studies and measuring physical activity and bringing technology within the technology. It was very important as well to have an extraordinary industry partner and to bring some extra hands at some point. So in the work we are now doing and exploring further, we engage in Solomon Islands, for example, as part of a participatory research workshop, trying to identify how digital technologies could be used for health promotion in adolescents in the Solomon Islands. And this is a picture of the workshop you can see on the left side. We spent a lot of time, again, in community and in schools to understand the context and to engage with students in co-design. And this is what you can see on the right side of the slides. At the bottom of the slide, the picture describes one of these participatory research work. So in conclusion, I would reflect on what we learned. So we learned that physical activity in the Pacific Islands is influenced by place, by country, community, and system. Using wrist activity trackers is feasible and well accepted, but needs investment in affordable solutions. Physical activity change in response to an intervention, but it's not linear, and this must inform the way we assess the effectiveness of intervention. More research is needed to inform effective policy change in the Pacific. What are the opportunities ahead? There's lots of opportunities in engaging with partnership, particularly with schools, ministries of education and ministries of health, multi-stakeholders, co-design and capacity building in the region, and working on adolescents' empowerment and leadership. And I will finish on this slide and recognizing the different collaborators to the work we have done in the Pacific Islands and the different institutions that have supported our work. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Renata Cinelli, and I am an Associate Professor at Australian Catholic University. Thank you very much to the ASPA School-Based Physical Activity SIG for the invitation and opportunity to present this webinar, which outlines some of my experiences working with some Pacific Island communities. Specifically, I'll share with you a couple of case studies and some of my learnings from being in the Solomon Islands and in Kiribati. So a little bit of context. I am a health and physical education teacher by trade. I worked in schools in New South Wales and then went on to do my PhD and become a university lecturer / researcher. Most of my work took place in Sydney, Melbourne, and in some Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory. Once I started working at ACU in Melbourne, I had the opportunity to join in with some international community engagement. And this is where I began working with schools, teachers, and Australian pre-service teachers in Solomon Islands. This branched out and I ended up taking pre-service teachers to Kiribati as well. And this work has spanned 12 years now. So it's been working with teachers. I've worked in preschools, primary schools, and secondary schools in various locations in Kiribati and Solomon Islands. I wanted to front load that I am sharing some stories, and this is in line with in many Pacific cultures. Learning is relational and knowledge is shared through stories and dialogues and sharing this lived experience. And I am reflecting on my own experiences working alongside Pacific Islander communities. I am absolutely not intending to generalize to all Pacific Island nations and communities. It is just my experiences of where I have been and the people that I have worked with. So, to give you a little bit of context about the places I am going to be sharing about, I worked in the Solomon Islands, and this is quite different to Kiribati when we look at this geographically and culturally as well. So, these pictures that you can see down the bottom here, both I've taken these photos when I was in these places. Solomon Islands, there are approximately 992 islands compared to 33 in Kiribati. The Solomon Islands is high islands, so these islands do come out of the ocean. They're high, and there's a lot of coastal settlements, so people live along the coast, whereas Kiribati is very low-lying. So you can have a lot of flooding in Kiribati, and actually the place where we were in Tarawa, which is the capital, is kind of like an L-shaped island where it's very thin, and most of the time you can see from one side of the island to the other. And what this means is it's low-lying, there's a lot of flooding, there's a lot of climate risk for sea level rising in Kiribati and salination. And this is where the land gets salt washed, and then there's food insecurity because you can't grow food where it's been salt washed. So there's a little bit of diversity there in that sense to be aware of. The Human Development Index ranking of these countries, you can see, is for Solomon Islands around 155 to 160 and 137 for Kiribati. And this compares to Australia, which is number 7. So our, I guess, position is one of privilege, which I absolutely acknowledge. And I want to emphasize that I'm trying to look at strengths, and there are so many strengths, but some of the challenges faced are really impossible to ignore because of these geographic risks and challenges that are faced. So I was involved in a study with Louisa, Peralta and Corinne, Caillaud, who I know you're going to hear from as well as part of this webinar series. And we looked at 22 countries and publications that existed about barriers and facilitators to physical activity and sport. Now, what I have done here is I've just done a summary table that outlines some of the things that came up in these studies, and I've put in bold the things that I noticed and that will relate to the case studies or the examples that I will present to you today. And some of them are more relevant in specific places or not. For instance, down the bottom left here, you'll notice the food insecurity. That was something that was noticed a lot more in Kiribati based on that salt washing and the accessibility of food that I mentioned. So different parts are relevant in different places. So looking at school physical education, and I can just preface here that all of the photos that you will see in this webinar today are my own. I took these photos when I was in these communities, and I think they just sort of provide a snapshot of some of the examples that I would like to share with you. So in terms of school physical education, a lot of what I saw was very traditional games and sports. There was an incredible level of high physical literacy. So there were high skills, highly developed skills in the preschools, primary schools, and secondary schools that I would say is a higher level than a lot of what I've seen actually in primary schools in Australia. There's difference. There's quite a high difference in what you would see children engaging in terms of building up physical literacy. And just to give you an example, this photo on the bottom right is a school on a small island. And in getting prepared for school physical education and a sporting competition that was taking place, they get the children out to do the garden maintenance. And what happens here is these children get these bush knives, which are like, basically they look like machetes It is not something you would see in Australia. And the children walk around and they cut the grass. And this just involves swinging their arms and cutting the grass with machetes. You will also see children scale coconut trees and get coconuts down. So the physical skills are developed in some different ways in different places, and this is particularly true on rural islands. But the facilities, so you'll see here I've put facilitators and barriers, and now these are linked to the table that I showed you previously that came up in other studies. Facilities I have put here as a facilitator because there was no issue with what was available as far as I saw for being able to do sports, physical activity, PE. It didn't matter that there wasn't a court available, for instance, in some places. PE was no problems. It was still engaged in almost daily in the schools that I was in. And the weather wasn't too much of a problem at least in the Solomons, except for when you get heavy rains. That, again, depends on where you are because some places are subject to flooding and may have less hospitable environments to be able to engage in if there's not courts available. Fun was another one. The children loved to be involved in PE. There was high uptake of this. The pictures you can see here are Savo Island, which is about an hour and a half boat ride from the main capital of Honiara. The picture up the top right is a timetable from a preschool in Kiribati. And so this just gives you an example of what happens in the school, in a preschool. So they finished halfway through the day, and this is largely due to the weather and the temperature. So it gets very, very hot. But you'll notice they have music and movement and outdoor play. And this is where they sort of would be doing PE style activities or games in sport and small-sided games. But a lot of what you see is cultural dance and music. And that happens, as far as I'm aware, across Kiribati and Solomons, across all of the different age levels. Community leaders' support and involvement is key. The schools that I was in the Solomon Islands really were very supportive and fostered sport. And I'll talk about some of the inter-school competitions that we helped to facilitate in a minute. But one of the barriers that came up was equipment availability. And so particularly in this island that is pictured, it is very difficult to get actual sporting resources or equipment. So funding is a challenge. But then actually just physically getting equipment there, it's everything in the country is imported in terms of sporting equipment. And so that carries a higher cost, but it is not as readily accessible as you would see in Australia. Teacher confidence or training is also sometimes a barrier to the certain types of activities that might take place. And the training that takes place, particularly in the Solomon Islands, is different. Now there is an increase in teachers being bachelor trained, but typically teachers would have a certificate or maybe a diploma in education, and this is usually related to content rather than pedagogy. So they haven't really been taught how to teach, and that goes back to being a lot of traditional games and sports because they teach how they were taught at school. And this is often teachers that had even less training than the current teachers have. This is shifting though. So there's becoming more and more opportunities for people to be able to engage in education, higher education, to get qualified. So the image here that we have on the left is PE in Kiribati, which gives you another, I guess, image of what it's like. This is a secondary school. And in the time that we were visiting, PE was largely focused on an upcoming carnival, and I'll talk about that carnival in a minute. But this is where everybody just sort of got involved, and it was basically playing volleyball. And there wasn't a lot of skills and drills. It was kind of just gameplay building up to the competition. On the right here, you'll see a PE lesson in the Solomon Islands. And this is significant because they're using squash rackets and balls that were donated by Squash Victoria. And this is something that was very novel in Solomon Islands because they had never engaged with squash before. There, to my knowledge, there's not a squash court around. Certainly not on this island. This island has no roads, and the children played with the rackets and the balls with each other, but not in a traditional sense of squash. They also did use their classrooms to use walls to be able to practice hitting off a wall. This will tie in a little bit. I'll come to sustainability. It's all good and well to be bringing equipment that is used, but unless there is someone there to help upskill the teachers to be able to learn how to use this equipment and some activities, and then ensuring that it's maintained and, you know, accessible into the future, it can be kind of tokenistic and fun. So it's important to think about that in terms of longevity of programs and accessibility to these kind of skills and equipment. So carnival days, something that we saw take place in Kiribati and in Solomon Islands. These photos are both in Kiribati, and this was a big carnival that took place with all secondary schools that were in Tarawa, and they did volleyball, there was soccer, there was athletics and track and field. And I think something that was key was there was high community buy-ins. There was a lot of parent and family involvement from each of the schools. So yeah, high numbers showed up to support this. But the inter-school competitions depend largely on location and accessibility. So 4 of these things, transportation, money, food insecurity, and weather conditions, really play into whether or not these things can take place. So you'll notice the picture down the bottom. It is on the way to the carnival in the morning. There was quite a bit of rain. This isn't exactly flooded. They could get there, but this is the transport that was available. And a table was thrown on top because it was very rainy. So for a bit of coverage. But there's a high degree of adaptability and resilience that most things the show must go on and does, regardless of what's going on. However, there are situations with like the accessibility. For instance, I mentioned Tarawa and Kiribati. It's really susceptible to flooding. So it may be that it is just not possible to get to a location, and this is happening more and more. So just to give you a little bit more context about that, Kiribati is one of the most climate threatened countries that is going to be affected by rising sea levels. So for a lot of the children that we were working with in their lifetime, they will need to relocate because they will not be able to sustain a healthy living in Kiribati. You'll see in the top picture, there's uniforms, that kind of thing. One of the things that we noticed was there was a school at these carnivals that was a faith-based school that actually was very wealthy compared to a lot of the other schools. And that school provided food. So the children and adolescents were fed daily. They all had breakfast and lunch at school. They were all provided with running shoes. They had access to state-of-the-art coaching. They had facilities at their school. And all of these factors showed in the performance where basically this school dominated in every activity that they partook. And so in speaking to some of the teachers and the Kiribati locals about this, they were saying really the primary thing is the food, the fact that the children would get fed at those schools. And that meant there was high demand for children to go to that school as well. Some of the facilitators came up as having friends, enjoying the activities, feelings of achievement. All of this was evident in the high uptake of these programs. And the community leaders' support and involvement, as I said, was really evident. So it's something that is culturally ingrained to be part of these community activities and sports. This is an example of a program that we ran while we were in Solomon Islands. So We ran an inter-school sports competition that was with children from Savo Island, which you can see here on an artwork that came from Savo, and Honiara, which is the capital of Guadalcanal, which is this main island here. And this, as I mentioned, is about an hour and a half boat ride from Savo to Honiara. And so these children that competed, we ran this for 2 years. The first year we took children from Poposi, you'll see on the right here. We took children from Poposi to Bishop Opal, and in the second year we took children from Bishop Opal Catholic School, the Becks, over to Poposi, so the children got to compete against each other, and this competition happened for 2 years in a row. I was working in Melbourne at the time and was able to get donated equipment from, as I mentioned, Squash Victoria, AFL Victoria, and Volleyball Victoria, and that determined the 3 sports that we played for these competitions. I also had workshops for my pre-service teachers run by those 3 organisations, where my pre-service teachers got the skills to coach and teach those 3 particular sports. What that meant was they then, when they were teaching in the schools leading up to this competition that they coordinated and put together, they were able to teach the children these sports and teach those skills, as well as the teachers. There was a lot of involvement and lead up and preparation and excitement for these competitions. We fundraised, which we were able to use fundraising money to provide the transport, which is paying for the boats to get all the children from one island to the other and back, food for the day, and that just meant that the communities were compensated basically for providing the food for the children, and we were able to buy the uniforms, which were then reused. To give you an example of how something like this is coordinated and I guess disseminated, or the information got out there to the communities, in Savo Island, which is where Poposi School is, the deputy principal of the school walked around with a megaphone one evening, calling all of the parents and families from the residing villages to come to the school so that he could talk to them and give the information about us taking children for this excursion, this sports competition, to the main island. And this walking around with a megaphone happened for about 40 minutes. And then all these families from the villages showed up and had sort of an information session about this. And then that information was trickled through back through the villages. It shows you, I guess, some of the different ways that things operate when you're working in remote islands. It was a lot easier to communicate that when we were in Honiara. And so it just goes to show you that even working in one country in 2 different places has really different challenges and ways of needing to do things. But the community leader support is really important if anything is going to have any success. So one of the things that I really wanted to, I guess, identify when we're talking about an initiative like this is thinking about how sustainable is this really? So this in itself, happy to critique, is not sustainable unless you have ongoing funding, unless you are visiting as well to be able to help provide new equipment, that kind of thing. But there are a number of good things that were done in terms of helping to teach the teachers the skills to be able to teach the sports, leaving the equipment there and the singlets. They basically were able to do this again if they wanted to. But for Savo, the people on Savo Island, they ran their own competitions on Savo with schools there, which eliminated the transport cost, which is key. That's the one thing that is a barrier that exists when we remove our support. You then have the ongoing upkeep of equipment and things getting lost and that kind of thing. So it's important to think about when initiatives are happening that are supporting physical activity or sports or physical education, about the sustainability and what is going to ensure the success or the ongoing success of these kind of programs. This particular initiative was not born out of a community ground up approach saying, we would love to learn about these sports. As I mentioned, it was whatever sports I could get donations for that supported this kind of initiative. The way that the inter-school competition would run was absolutely done with the school leaders and the community leaders of both schools, which happened to work very well together because there's a lot of family connections between these schools as well. So it's important thinking about as well working together as opposed to coming in and doing 4 or 2. It needs to be community and collaborative approaches. So when thinking about working in the Pacific, I want to emphasize that a one-size-fits-all approach is unlikely to work. It's really important to understand the differences, geographic, cultural, environmental, all of the differences that take place even within one country, let alone across the Pacific. The other thing is that relationships are far more important than the resources. So physical resources you can often find workarounds, but the relationships with the people that you're working with are really important. And very fortunately, as I mentioned, I've been working with the teachers and the people in the Solomon Islands for 12 years now. Kiribati was only 2 years, but I was working with people who had been working in this program for years before that as well. So the relationships are built up over time. It's absolutely not a quick approach. Capacity building is really important and more important than short-term intervention. So like I said, all good and well to bring equipment, but it's about being able to upskill and provide opportunities for people to learn and then be able to action things in communities as well. And schools can be really great catalysts, but it's really important to think much more broadly than just schools, not in isolation. So I wanted to acknowledge some of the people that I have worked with and built these relationships with, including Mr. Jackson Meckett, Mr. Robert Kemakeza, Mr. Peter Billy Ofa, Mrs. Hilda Nwaki, Associate Professor Melita Jones, Professor Caroline Smith, Associate Professor Monica Wong, Professor Dennis McLaughlin, and many others. All of these people have worked together over time to develop these initiatives and welcome our pre-service teachers and work together to provide opportunities for teachers in the countries that we have worked with, but also for Australian pre-service teachers. So that concludes my webinar. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I hope you have enjoyed my talk.
Hello, everybody. My name is Associate Professor Louisa Peralta. I'm here to present as part of this webinar on Pacific Islander communities and territories and the promotion of physical activity. I'm based in the School of Education and Social Work within the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney and also attached to the Charles Perkins Centre at the University of Sydney. I'm speaking or presenting on behalf of a number of researchers that have been involved in the research that I'm going to present today. And they come from a number of institutions, particularly across the Pacific Islands, communities, countries, and territories. And I will acknowledge those now in the next screen. But before I do so, we would also like to acknowledge that this program of work has been ongoing for a number of years and has been an offshoot of another research program that's been happening in the Pacific Islands, and in particular New Caledonia, also for an extended period of time. So we have had funding over a number of years, particularly from 2 funding groups so far. So the University of Sydney Global Engagement Group, who fund projects that focus on enhancing the Sustainable Development Goals, of which our project touches on 5 of those, in particular, good health and wellbeing and climate action and quality education. We've also received funding from the Pacific Fund to keep our work sustainable to a certain extent, and we're continuing to look for more funding as we move forward. So what I need to do now is to obviously acknowledge the number of other researchers and institutions who are part of the project and the program of work that we've been doing and the data that we're going to present today. So these photos only show again a few of us, but in general, there is a large base of researchers at the University of Sydney, particularly from the Faculty of Medicine and Health, but also Architecture and Design and Education and Social Work and Arts and Social Sciences. We've also had some honours students who have worked with some of the data or collected the data or analysed the data in one way or another. And we've had really strong partnerships with the University of New Caledonia, with Olivier Golly and some of his co-researchers and school connections, and also researchers from the National University in Vanuatu, particularly Pascal and Anise. So they're photos of some of the researchers and some of the co-contributors in New Caledonia and Lifu, which is an island off New Caledonia. So why are we focusing on adolescents and today on New Caledonia? So if we look more broadly at the Pacific Islands, we know that obesity prevalence in adolescents in and across the Pacific Island countries and territories has increased to about 35%, which means that the health and wellness of approximately 2 million young people in and across the Pacific Islands, their health is threatened, and we need to do something to help them. And so when to help adolescents in particular and to utilize the resources and the assets that adolescents have. So New Caledonia, why New Caledonia? We know that one of the risk factors for overweight and obesity is physical activity. And the most recent data, which we probably need to acknowledge is not very recent, but Olivier and Guillaume produced some research that was published in 2021 that showed that approximately 2/3 of adolescents in New Caledonia were attaining the physical activity recommendations of 60 minutes of physical activity or moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. However, in that data set, there were some really strong geographical and sex differences. And with other research that I conducted a number of years ago as well, there are some really explicit physical activity barriers and facilitators that adolescents in New Caledonia, as well as across the Pacific Islanders, experience. And so it's very important to acknowledge that therefore, this research is a very important piece of research for benefiting adolescents' health. Alongside, obviously, the barriers that are experienced by adolescents in the Pacific Islands and in New Caledonia around physical activity, what we've seen in the last 5 or 10 years is an acknowledgement that screen time has started to eat into some of their leisure and obviously physical activity time. And although this research has not been published as yet, the research from our colleagues in New Caledonia has shown that our New Caledonian adolescents are they're not meeting, a high proportion of them are not meeting the screen time recommendations. So as you can see here, there was a geographical difference with screen time use. There was significantly higher use among adolescents living in urban areas in terms of screen time per day, so 3 hours of screen time per day for our city-dwelling New Caledonian adolescents versus adolescents in rural areas, which were still accessing screen time for approximately 2.5 hours per day. So again, that's another area of concern in terms of working with adolescents, particularly in New Caledonia, but that may be also, resembling what's happening across the Pacific Island countries and territories. So knowing these pivotal points of information coming from New Caledonian researchers at the University of New Caledonia, we devised with them the API project, which stands for the Australian Pacific Youth Project. And the idea around this project was to work with adolescents to co-design, first listen to their views and experiences around health and some of the risk factors for poorer health, which is lifestyle behaviours such as physical activity and food and nutrition, but also to listen to adolescents' views and experiences of being in their environment, which has been now quite influenced by climate change. And to see how this all fits together to have an impact on their health. We have produced some research around adolescents in Vanuatu and their levels of health literacy and digital health literacy, and how that fits within curriculum in that context. So we're looking at the social determinants of health as well, and how we're starting to explore how this may also have an influence or impact on physical activity and food and nutrition. But for the API project and for the premise of what we're sharing today, we're going just to focus on what data we've collected with working with adolescents in New Caledonia around physical activity. And in particular, the role of digital technologies now in terms of their physical activity levels, but also in the future in enhancing their physical activity levels. And just to let you know, these are actual photos of different parts of New Caledonia and Vanuatu as a way to set up the project. So when we're focusing on today and what we're sharing, the API project was put together to collaborate with adolescents to identify adolescents' priorities to achieve healthy lives and well-being while developing climate resilience. And two, to explore how digital technologies can be utilised or leveraged to address challenges and enable positive lifestyle behaviour changes. Because we're focusing on physical activity today, we've thought it was important to share some snapshots or photos of the places and spaces both in New Caledonia and in Lifu and in Vanuatu, to give you an idea about what physical activity might look like in those places and spaces. As we have a quick summary or overview of these photos, you can see that there is a variety of different physical activities or sports experienced by adolescents in these spaces. There is a little bit of physical activity promotion and celebration with murals. There is some fantastic facilities that are available for our young people or their young people to use. And they seem to be in a variety of different places and spaces, so not the same places and spaces being utilised and not necessarily the same sports and physical activities being utilised, although there it does look like it tends to be futsal or soccer orientated. You might pick up a few other things from these photos in terms of, PE is down in this bottom left-hand corner. And there's a little bit of sitting and watching or observing, and only a few, again, maybe half the group playing or being active or learning. And the same for this organised sport types of activities on the right-hand side. So again, there seems to be limited space for the amount of adolescents that might be in that space or the utilisation of that space. So for the data we're presenting today, we collected this in November 2023. We visited 3 high schools through the connections with the University of New Caledonia, and they were generally connections with health and physical education teachers. 2 of those high schools were in urban areas, and 1 high school was in a rural area of New Caledonia. And altogether, we were able to engage 146 adolescents in the research data collection methods. As you could have seen by the previous slide over here on the right and in the photos on this slide, there are a number of different places and spaces within the school that we utilised. If it was a PE class, we were on gym mats in a hall or outside on a concrete court. And then in some, if it was taken up in a health or a science curriculum lesson, we were therefore in a classroom context. So the participatory workshop with adolescents was done in curriculum time. It was small group work. As you can see, there are 4 students here working together on this work booklet with a facilitator, which was an honours student at that time. And there's myself with 2, but I think there was a 3rd over here next to the wall, a small group of 3 students. So we kept the groups relatively small to have as much input from each of the individuals or each of the adolescents engaged in the activity and in the research. The approach was using a storytelling approach, which we co-designed with teachers and with some adolescents before implementing the research project. And so therefore we used a scenario that was local or context relevant to set the scene. And we provided some health information and some instructions to kind of lead into a series of questions in which the students were able to respond in using both illustrations or drawings and text, so written responses. We also gave students choice around whether they wanted to utilise a work booklet in their native tongue, which was most often French, or in English. And as you can see by my photo over here and with our honours student photo over here, most of the students opted for their native tongue, so they completed the work booklets in French, and that is for most of the researchers involved not a language that we're fluent in. So we're using a lot of translation on our phones to ensure that we could give as much information to the students as a prompt or instructions or facilitation as possible. Also, 50% of the work booklets were focused on physical activity and the other 50% was on food and nutrition. However, for today, we will just share the physical activity data. So just to give you a bit of an idea, and I'll give you a little time to read through the scenario, but this is the scenario that we devised for students that were engaged in New Caledonia. We had a different scenario for students in Vanuatu, and a different scenario again for students in Australia that we have used this with. The main idea was obviously to make the story and the scenario meaningful and relevant to their context. Sophia, the photo over here, is one of our other honours students who worked with the data, the physical activity data that came out of Vanuatu, New Caledonia and Australia, but she's presenting data there from the New Caledonian Australian students in terms of the physical activity components of the work booklet. So we were going to share, obviously, the data that's come out of New Caledonia. So students read through that scenario and we are going to present today their responses to question 9 of that work booklet. And that was the question that was focusing on students being an inventor and inventing the next generation of digital technologies to support them being physically active now, but also physically active sometime in the future. So if you're an inventor, what digital or electronic technology could you invent to help young people like yourselves to better understand physical activity, their own physical activity or others' physical activity, how they could help themselves and others be more physically active and improve their physical capacity to be active in ideal conditions. We gave a few examples, like it could be used or worn, measures or recording information. It could interact with the user, and obviously it could connect with the internet through network coverage. We did stipulate, however, that they would need to answer with an illustration or drawing of that digital technology, and with explanatory text to help unpack what it is that digital technology would be doing and feeding the users. So in the next couple of slides, we've got some example responses from the New Caledonian sample of adolescents. So if you look from left to right, we could obviously see an app that would fit, in their phone. It would be a phone app or a screen app on an iPad, whatever technology they had access to, and that app would provide them with the information they needed to be physically active. Over here on your right-hand side, we have Veronique, who is wearing a particular monitor that would feed information back to a phone that would then feed information back to Veronique or whoever the user is or was. We also have some technologies that would link, brain functions to the heart functions, and they'd be feeding information back and forth to encourage or to motivate or enhance physical activity. As you can see here on the right-hand side, there are a variety of different wearables that the students came up with. So obviously there's, a watch, a smartwatch of some type or some kind. Even though this is an invention, they invented something that would be adolescent appropriate. So they felt like the smartwatches or the wearables that they had access to would need to be modified to be able to be more appropriate for them to enhance their physical activity. We have some connections between other parts of the body, very similar, but this one was, it sits on the arm, the wearable, but then it was also be connected to heart and lungs. Over here, we have just an arm wearable, and then we have a shoe, which is, again, ASICs. They labeled it as ASICs, so something that's already exists that needed modification to be more appropriate for them to motivate or enhance their physical activity. And the last one we'll show you, so it doesn't capture all of them, but I guess it's a snapshot. So the last one we have time to share with you today is what they call the motivator. And as you can see, it's not a wearable, it's not connected to a screen or a phone or app like the others. It's an external piece of technology that the adolescent would visit to get motivation to be physically active. So the first step of what we needed to do once we had collated all of the physical activity data from the students in New Caledonia was to obviously translate the French to English for the majority of researchers to be able to, utilize and analyze. And so our lead researcher, Professor Corinne Caillaud, who is also on this webinar, is a French native and therefore a native speaker, and did the translations herself. And as you can see there, it was quickly summarized into, this is an app, has a female name, Veronique, and it says a recorder placed in bra that records breathing, heart rate, body temperature, and it gets fed all that data and details would be fed into an app or onto a phone, and which would then be able to provide feedback to the user as they're exercising. So we had to do this across all of the images and all of the texts that were associated with the images or the drawings or the illustrations. So first was translation. Once the translations were done, although it doesn't show you there, it's still in French, but we then were able to do some qualitative thematic analysis. And we decided to use qualitative thematic analysis because it allowed us to use 3 different sets of data. So the first was the researchers themselves describing the drawing. And we did that using a quadrant type of approach. So we described the drawing as a whole, and then we use quadrants to then pick up any subtleties in any of the drawings in more detail. And as you can see here, the purple text demonstrates the researchers' analysis using the quadrant framework. The blue text is associated with the translation of the text that the student wrote or the students wrote. And so that's captured in the blue writing there. And the last thing we did at the end of the workshop, once students had completed question 9 of the work booklet, we asked the students to just step outside of the classroom, and we took an audio recording of any additional extra descriptions of the digital technology that they thought they wanted to share with us as researchers. And so we added any additional information in black in terms of that thematic analysis. So if there was anything new or addition that wasn't captured via the research description or the text, the student's text, we added the audio recordings to give a well-rounded type of analysis of each of the images or illustrations or drawings. So the results for the New Caledonian adolescents was that there were 36 different types of digital technologies that were invented as part of question 9 responses. There were, in terms of design, which means these are the particular parts of the type that kind of make it stand out or be user friendly or functional. And so there were 44 kind of different design aspects that we captured as part of the types. And then additional to that, we looked at the features and the functions that were described by students or that we could see or that were written down next to the images themselves. Was that there were 64 different types of features associated with those digital technologies. So overall, 56% of the digital technology designs were adaptations of existing technologies. Which tells us that the technologies that are currently out there that potentially adolescents have access to are not quite fitting what they need or what they want. So therefore, 39% of the designs were entirely original. So they were brand new digital technologies that weren't or haven't been invented and have not been utilized for physical activity promotion before. So that again is telling you that their adolescents are calling out for something new and different because what's out there is not actually helping them enhance their physical activity or to continue to be active. And 6% were previously existing, reinforcing the point that we need to do more in terms of digital technologies for adolescents to increase physical activity. So the diverse range of innovations that were devised, even from one, context or one country, with being New Caledonia, included different types of wearables, apps, phone functionalities, robots, treadmills, alarm clocks, gaming consoles, machines, and even an electronic pill. However, there were some, similar principles that we can, or some really important points that we thought was important to extract from their inventions. So we have 6 to share today. So inventions often involved a wearable device and an app used on a phone. So there was connectivity importance in terms of it couldn't just be sitting on one piece of technology. It needed to be, connected to a number of pieces of technology to make it functional, wearable, and I guess feasible to be used for adolescents. Something really interesting was that some of these innovations had elements of equity. So, for example, the robot, one of the robots that were created adapted skills or adapted physical activity or exercise advice according to capabilities and disability. So if there was, an injured person or adolescent who needed to have further adaptations, the robot would do that for them. Or the robot or could also, uh, you know, modify or simplify a skill, a sport-specific skill, if that particular adolescent was new. It was a new skill for them, or it was their first time of playing a particular sport. Some of the inventions were used, or actually all of the inventions that were created were only to be used during the workout, or during physical activity. So they weren't meant to be accessible at all times. Adolescents preferred it to have, a functional use only during the exercise or during the workout time. The invention controls the time spent on a device for other activities. So that meant that adolescents opted for uh, using each of the digital technologies that they invented for physical activity. And once they had reached the physical activity recommendations for that day, they could then unlock that invention for other uses. So that was particularly appropriate for things like apps and phones. Um, but there were some others that were created, and you could use different creations for different ways. And so they said, though, first and foremost, we had to reach our physical activity goals to be able to then access the other parts of the invention. The invention informs the user of specific uh, physical activity components. So, for example, if it was something to do with preparing to be fit for a particular carnival, linking back to the scenario, or if they were doing a community fun run, then the invention would inform the user of what specific training they would need to do to be able to get to that end goal. And there was also some comments around specific workouts, so around resistance training and strength. Um, the invention would be able to give specific advice on how to do that, but also how to and when to increase weight and to what weight would be increased to. So to ensure that there was progressive overload. So they understood the idea that it would have to be specific to the individual, where they're currently at, to meet their goals, but also to ensure that there was appropriate steps or scaffolds or overload. And the last was that the inventions generally had some coaching or motivational messaging involved or integrated. So it came through obviously in the robot example that there would be some tailoring of what was delivered to the user, but then also there would be some coaching as to how they could do something better, but also how they could increase, their weight or resistance, or be able to adapt a skill to be able to adapt some activities so they could better learn the skill to move forward. The motivator that we shared with you was a perfect example of motivational messaging. But adolescents felt like, or there were groups of adolescents that felt like motivation was an important facet that maybe they didn't have intrinsically, that they needed to source extrinsically. And so the digital technology pieces would be their motivational source. And so there would be messages sent to them, or they would go to a source and get the motivation that they needed to be active. So we acknowledged and we thanked all the researchers that had been involved up until this point in time in the API project, but now I think it's really important to thank the New Caledonian adolescents who participated in this arm of the project that we're sharing today. And as you can see, this is a photo of a group of New Caledonian adolescents who did complete the workshop and the work booklets for us. And as you can tell, they were very motivated adolescents who were keenly motivated to do the workshop and the work booklet. Lastly, I gave my email address at the start of the slides, but I'll leave Corinne's email address here as being the lead researcher. There are a number of arms to the API project. There are a number of projects that kind of sit within what we're doing as researchers under the promotion of health and well-being for Australian and Pacific Islander adolescents. And so we've now created a larger group with a new logo, and a new name, which is Pacific Youth Connect Health Research and Innovation. So if you are excited by some of the work that we've shared today, you want to know more, or you'd love to participate, or you have a skill set that you think will be a positive contribution to what we're already doing, please feel free to email Corinne or myself. And if you see this logo, feel free to, use the connections within this logo as it's been going to be used in future to connect with obviously any of our other collaborators, particularly in the Pacific Islands. Thank you for listening. Hopefully I didn't go too long. Look forward to hopefully connecting with you sometime in the future and potentially at the ASPA conference at the end of the year. Goodbye.